Hi parents, this is Lindsay Ellis, your student's 7th and 8th grade language arts tutor for this year. This is a crash course on how best to help your student with their Fix-It Grammar daily corrections. Every day when they start a new passage, they should go in this order. They should first find their prepositional phrases. After they have found those, they move on to verbs, subject. Once they have found each of their subject and verb pairings, they can move on to clauses. Once they've determined if it's a main clause or dependent clause, they can find where commas are needed or where commas need to be removed. And then punctuation and sentence openers happen almost at the same time because determining where the sentence openers sometimes determines if a comma is needed. And then also, if we have to add additional punctuation because we have too many main clauses in a sentence, causing a run-on sentence, we will have additional sentence openers. At the end, we will look for spelling errors, word misusage, any hyphens, capitalizations, and etc., any other grammatical fixes that need to be applied. On this page, we have a sentence that comes from day 1 of week 3 from your student's Fix-It book for this year. The sentence reads, "To each one of the young princesses, the Sea King bequeathed a garden plot where she might dig and plant like she pleased. One princess arranged her flower bed like a whale, another as a mermaid. That of the youngest contained flowers as red as the sun's rays at sunset." So if we're starting with our prepositional phrases, this is why it's incredibly important that your student understand, know, and memorize their prepositions. Once they have been able to identify the prepositions and their correct usage, it will help them determine better where the verb and the subject of the sentence are, because they will never be contained in a prepositional phrase. So this is a way for us to cut out a lot of words that will sometimes get in the way. So let's see what we mean here. In this sentence, we have several prepositional phrases. The first, to each one. The second, of the young princesses. The third, as a whale. The next, as a mermaid. Of the youngest, as the sun's rays, and at sunset. These are our prepositional phrases for this sentence. Now, we know that a verb is never going to be contained in a prepositional phrase. Prepositional phrase's rule is a preposition plus a noun at the end of the phrase. In between the preposition and the noun will contain an article or other adjectives and so on, as we can see in of the young princess, of being the preposition, the an article, and young describing princesses. Because we know that there are no verbs in prepositional phrases, we can start looking for action words in the parts of the sentence that have not been underlined. So we start looking for action words, which are going to be our verbs. So the first that we see is going to be bequeathed. Now, to find the subject of bequeathed, we have to ask who or what bequeathed. And we know from this it would be Sea King. So now we have a subject and verb pairing, Sea King bequeathed. The next is going to be might, dig, and plant. So might, dig, plant are all verbs referring back to she. So we ask the question, what might, dig, and plant? And we come up with she. The same with pleased and she, arranged, princess, and contained, that. Now the last of these subject and verb pairings, that and contained, can be a little tricky because we have a prepositional phrase in between them. So when you see the verb contained, it's very easy to say, what or who contained? And immediately look at the word that comes before and say, youngest contained. Well, we know that cannot be true because of the youngest is a prepositional phrase, so it cannot be the subject of the sentence. And in fact, what we have is that is what contained, because that is referring back to flower bed. So we have in this sentence 5 subject and verb pairings. Now, other things that your student might have to look for is, do the subjects and verbs agree? Which is sometimes where we need a review on subject-verb agreement. Now, as you're looking at the subject and verb, something else your student is going to have to pay attention to is, do the subject and verb agree? In the sense, are both singular or are both plural? They have to be the same for the sentence to make sense. You can't have the subject be singular and then the verb be plural or vice versa. In those cases, that does not work and it would need to be corrected. In this case, though, we have 5 subject and verb pairings, which means we will have 5 clauses. So now what we need to determine is, where do those clauses begin and end? And from there, we can see whether or not we have the commas in the correct place, and if we don't, do we need to add or remove? On this screen, you will see both brackets and parentheses. Brackets are representing main clauses, and parentheses are representing dependent clauses. Now, further along in the year, it will be important that your student understand the difference between a dependent clause and an adverb clause. Now, an adverb clause is always a dependent clause, but in Fix-It, we like to differentiate what is an adverb clause and what is a dependent clause. But currently now, it is more important that your student understand the difference between a main clause and dependent clause. The rules for clauses are as follows. A clause is a group of related words that must have both a subject and a verb. A main clause is also known as an independent clause and can stand alone as a sentence if taken out of this passage. A dependent clause cannot stand alone in a sentence. Dependent clauses are basically main clauses with another word or words in front that turn the main clause into something that leaves us hanging that cannot stand alone as a sentence. If a dependent clause is in a sentence, it must be attached to a main clause to be a legal sentence. It is important that your student have their grammar cards with them while they are making their daily corrections, especially when it comes to identifying clauses. Again, in this passage, we see 5 subject and verb pairings, which means we will have 5 clauses present. At the beginning of the passage, to each one of the young princesses, you will see that the clause mark, the bracket, is not surrounding those phrases. Main clauses usually start with a subject or with an article or adjectives plus the subject. So in this case, we see the Sea King bequeathed a garden plot, the being an article and Sea King being the subject. That means that this is the most natural place where our first clause will begin. A clause will end at its most natural point. In this case, the Sea King bequeathed a garden plot. Our next subject and verb pairing is she might dig plant. If this group of words were just she might dig and plant, that could stand alone as a main clause. But because we have the word where, which is a WWW word, also can be identified on a grammar card, this has now become a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone and does not follow the main clause rule that says it usually starts with a subject or with an article or adjective plus the subject. The same is for like she pleased. Now the next subject and verb pairing, princess arranged, starts with an adjective of princess, one princess. So we know this is probably going to be a main clause. Plus, when we take it to its natural ending point, one princess arranged her flower bed as a whale, another as a mermaid, we can see that if this statement were taken out of the passage, it could stand alone as a sentence. The next, that of the youngest, contained flowers as red as the sun's rays at sunset. Now this can be a little tricky. because that is actually part of the who, which card, which says that that is usually the beginning of a dependent clause. But in this case, because that is the subject of contained, this follows the main clause rule that says main clauses usually start with a subject. So these are our clauses, both main and dependent. Now earlier I mentioned the rule for main clauses in a sentence. We cannot have more than one main clause in a sentence without a comma and a coordinating conjunction. The coordinating conjunctions can be found on the card with fanboys. If two main clauses are in a sentence and they do not make sense with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, then it is better to replace the comma with a period and make a new sentence. So let's see where we have that here. In this passage, we have three main clauses. So we have a rather long run-on sentence. In this case, it's also known as a comma splice because there are only commas and no coordinating conjunctions in this sentence. Here instead of having one long sentence, we now have three sentences. The first contains a main clause and two dependent clauses. The second is one long main clause, as well as the third. On this next screen, you'll see multiple places where the colors have changed. We have a number 2, a number 1, two periods, and a comma. So let's talk about why those are there. The number 2 and the number 1s represent what kind of sentence openers are starting each sentence. The first, where it says number 2, to each one of the young princesses, is declaring that this sentence opener is a prepositional phrase opener. Prepositional phrase openers do not take commas unless the prepositional phrases are made up of 5 words or more. This also applies when 2 or more prepositional phrases are back to back. So in this case, we have more than 5 words, so a comma will appear at the end of the prepositional phrases, making this a number 2 opener. The second 2 sentences are number 1 openers because they begin with the subject of the sentence. You'll also see that 1 and that have been capitalized because they are beginning a sentence. Next, we see multiple words that have been misused. In Week 3's Learn It, there is a section on the rules for hyphens. Those rules state that compound adjectives that come before a noun take hyphens. We need to look at these words to determine, are they a compound adjective that happened before a noun? What we actually see is that all 3 of these words are not compound adjectives, but compound nouns. The rules for compound nouns say that most often compound nouns do not use hyphens, and you actually need to look up the word in the dictionary to determine if the word should be 2 separate words or 1 word. In this case, garden plot is actually 2 words without the hyphen. Flower bed and sunset, we remove the hyphen and it becomes 1 word. Other word misusage is the as versus like. This is a common mistake, but something that we do need to pay attention to. In this first statement, like she pleased, like does not belong. It needs to be replaced with as because this is not a prepositional phrase. The next 2, as a whale and as a mermaid, these are 2 prepositional phrases that are actually nouns comparing one to another. This is where like would be used rather than as. The last example that we can see in this sentence is as the sun's rays. This prepositional phrase using as is correct because it is describing a function or job. The last point I would like to make is that there are 2 commas in this sentence that were there originally and have remained. We have not removed them. The Sea King bequeathed a garden plot, comma, and like a whale, comma, another, like a mermaid. These commas should remain because the statements that come after are non-essential elements. Now, non-essential elements is not a concept that we have formally gone over in class. However, if you see commas in a sentence and are not sure whether or not they should remain or be removed, go to your glossary and remind yourself of the rule of non-essential elements. This will help you determine if the comma should remain. I hope this explanation and crash course on Fix-It Grammar has been helpful. If you need any additional information or would like to sit down with me one-on-one, I would be happy to accommodate.